In April 2003, a man walked into a canyon in Utah. He was 27 years old. He was experienced, he was confident. He had done this hundreds of times before. He packed light, he moved fast. He told no one exactly where he was going, not because he was careless, but because he was experienced enough to trust himself. 5 days later, he would walk out of that canyon, but he would leave a part of himself behind. This is not a story about recklessness. This is not a story about heroism. This is a story about one mistake, one impossible decision, and the choice between dying in silence or doing the unthinkable. In one quiet canyon, in one split second, everything changed. A single misstep, a shifting boulder, and suddenly survival became a question with only one terrible answer. In one quiet canyon, a single mistake turned into a fight for survival that would test the absolute limits of the human will. This is the true story of Aron Ralston and what he did to stay alive. His name was Aron Ralston, 27 years old, a mechanical engineer, an outdoorsman, a climber, a man who found peace in solitude and purpose in the wilderness. He wasn't a daredevil. He wasn't chasing adrenaline for its own sake. He was methodical, calculated, prepared. He had summited nearly all of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks, 59 of them, alone, in winter. He understood risk. He respected danger. He knew how to read the mountains, the weather, the stone. Aron loved the solitude of solo hiking, the silence that comes when you're miles from another human being, the clarity, the freedom of moving through the wild on your own terms, at your own pace, with nothing but your thoughts and the landscape. To him, the wilderness wasn't just recreation. It was meditation. It was life. He had quit his job at Intel. He had chosen a life that prioritized adventure over security, freedom over comfort. He worked part-time. He climbed full-time. He lived simply, intentionally. On April 26, 2003, Aron drove to Utah's Canyonlands National Park. His plan was simple: explore the remote slot canyons near a place called Blue John Canyon, ride his mountain bike partway in, hike the rest, climb, descend, explore. He carried a small backpack, some water, a little food, basic climbing gear, a cheap multi-tool, a video camera. He told no one exactly where he was going. He didn't leave a detailed itinerary, not because he was irresponsible, but because this was how he always operated. He was experienced, he trusted himself, and on that day, in that moment, that decision seemed reasonable. But in the wilderness, every decision carries weight, every choice echoes, and sometimes the smallest oversight becomes the difference between life and death. Blue John Canyon is not famous. It doesn't appear in guidebooks. It's not marked on most maps. It's remote, beautiful, dangerous in the way all narrow canyons are dangerous, unpredictable, unforgiving, indifferent. Slot canyons are formed by water. Over millennia, flash floods carve through sandstone, creating passages that can be just a few feet wide and hundreds of feet deep. The walls are smooth, polished, the curves elegant, but beauty hides danger. In a slot canyon, a single rainstorm miles away can send a wall of water rushing through with no warning. Boulders that seem stable can be barely resting in place. Rockfall is common. Escape routes are limited. Aron knew all of this. He had descended into canyons like this before. He knew to move carefully, watch for loose rock, test your weight, pay attention. But knowledge doesn't stop accidents. Caution doesn't guarantee control. On that morning, April 26th, the air was clear. The sky was bright blue. The temperature was perfect. Nothing felt dangerous. Aron rode his bike across the desert plateau, stashed it, began hiking, entered the canyon system. The descent was technical but manageable, hand-over-hand climbing, wedging between narrow walls, rappelling down short drops. He moved with confidence. He had done this 1,000 times. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt unusual, until it was. He was descending through a particularly narrow section of the canyon. The walls were about 3 feet apart, smooth sandstone rising high above him, shadow and light playing across the surface. There was a boulder wedged between the walls. Not unusual. Canyons are full of chalkstones, rocks that have fallen and become wedged in place. Climbers use them all the time. You test them, you trust them, you move on. Aron stepped onto the boulder. It shifted, not violently, not dramatically, just moved. A tiny shift, a fraction of an inch, and in that instant, everything changed. 800 pounds of sandstone dislodged, fell, dropped 3 feet, and pinned his right hand and forearm against the canyon wall. Complete, immediate, total. The impact was crushing. His hand was smashed, his forearm trapped, the boulder, immovable, wedged between the narrow walls. The first response was shock, then confusion, then pain, then desperate, frantic effort. Aron tried to lift the boulder. He pushed with his legs, pulled with his free arm, used every ounce of strength he had. It didn't move, not even slightly. He tried to shift it sideways, to rotate it, to find any angle, any leverage that might free his arm. Nothing. He tried to pull his arm out. He pulled until his shoulder felt like it would dislocate, until his vision blurred with pain. His hand wouldn't budge. He was stuck, completely, utterly stuck. He used his climbing gear, his ropes, his carabiners, his knowledge of mechanical advantage and physics. He tried to create pulleys, to rig systems that might shift the boulder even an inch. Nothing worked. The boulder was wedged perfectly. Gravity and friction held it in place with a force he couldn't overcome. Hours passed. The sun moved slowly across the sky above. The thin strip of blue visible between the canyon walls shifted. The shadows grew long, and Aron Ralston began to understand. No one knew where he was. Not exactly, not specifically. No one was coming. No rescue was planned. No search would begin. He was alone. Completely, absolutely alone. Trapped in a place where no one would think to look, where no one would hear him scream, where death would come slowly, quietly, inevitably, unless he found a way out. Day 1. Hope. Aron believed he could free himself. He had to believe it. He was strong. He was smart. He had survived difficult situations before. He had supplies, a little water, maybe a leader, some food, a headlamp, a video camera. He tried everything he could think of. He chipped at the rock with his cheap multi-tool. The blade was dull. The rock was hard. After an hour, he had barely scratched the surface. He tried rigging more elaborate pulley systems. He tried different angles, different positions. He pushed. He pulled. He screamed into the empty canyon. The boulder didn't move. As the sun set, the temperature dropped. The desert cold set in. Temperatures that had been pleasant during the day plummeted to near freezing. Aron was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. He had no sleeping bag, no jacket. He shivered through the night. Every position was uncomfortable. He couldn't lie down. He couldn't sit properly. He could only stand or crouch awkwardly, his arms suspended, trapped. He rationed his water carefully. A few sips. Not too much. Make it last. He hoped someone might notice he was missing. Maybe a friend would call. Maybe someone would wonder where he was. But no one did, because he hadn't told anyone where he was going. Day 2. Desperation. The sun rose. The heat returned. Aron's arm was swelling. The skin was turning dark purple. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. The circulation was cut off. His water was running low. Maybe half a liter left. His mouth was dry. His lips were beginning to crack. The reality was setting in. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was life-threatening. He started recording messages on his video camera, messages to his family, to his mother, his father, his sister. He spoke about his life, his adventures, his regrets, the things he wished he had said, the time he wished he had spent with them. He apologized for not telling anyone where he was going. He tried to sound hopeful, but his voice betrayed him. He wasn't ready to die, but he was beginning to understand that death was possible, perhaps even likely. He tried once more to free himself, used the multi-tool to chip away at the rock, tried to saw through the stone itself. It was futile. The blade was meant for cutting rope, not sandstone. He saved his energy, conserved his movement, tried to stay calm, but panic was creeping in. The edges of his consciousness were becoming fuzzy. Fear was becoming constant. Day 3. Reality. Aron's water was nearly gone. A few sips left, nothing more. His body was shutting down. Dehydration was setting in. His tongue was swelling. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His urine was dark brown. The sun during the day was unbearable. The canyon walls reflected heat. He was cooking. At night he froze. His body shook uncontrollably. He made a decision, a terrible necessary decision. He began drinking his own urine, not out of madness, out of necessity, out of survival. It was warm, acidic, disgusting, but it was liquid. It kept him alive a little longer. He carved his name into the canyon wall, used the multi-tool to scratch into the sandstone, his name, his birth date, and the date he believed would be his death, April 30th, 2003. He recorded more messages. His voice was weaker now, hoarse. He could barely speak. He talked about the life he had lived, the mountains he had climbed, the sunrises he had seen. He talked about love, about family, about gratitude. He had accepted that he was going to die here. Day 4, hallucinations. Aron's mind began to break. He saw things that weren't there, heard voices in the silence. His memories became vivid, overwhelming. He saw his mother's face, his sister's laugh, He heard his father's voice. He saw future visions, dreams. A young boy running through sunlight, a child he would never meet. The line between reality and imagination was dissolving. His body was dying, cell by cell, organ by organ. The dehydration was critical. His kidneys were failing. His heart was struggling. The pain in his arm had become constant, a dull throb that never stopped. But somewhere, deep inside, a part of him refused to surrender. A small, stubborn part of his consciousness that whispered, "Not yet. Not like this." Day 5, the decision. Aron woke to the realization that this was his last day. He didn't have the strength for another night. His body had reached its limit. He had thought about it before, on day 2, day 3. The idea had flickered in his mind like a terrible shadow, and he had pushed it away. But now, on day 5, it was no longer a thought. It was the only option. The rock would never move. Rescue would never come. He had 2 choices. Die here, slowly, quietly, alone in this canyon, let his body decay until hikers found his bones months or years later, or do the one thing he had been avoiding, the one thing that terrified him more than death itself. He would have to cut off his own arm. Aron had thought about amputation before. Early on, he had considered it logically, clinically, but every time, he had concluded it was impossible. He didn't have the right tools. His multi-tool blade was dull, designed for cutting rope and packaging, not flesh and bone. He didn't have medical supplies, no anesthetic, no way to properly stop the bleeding, and he didn't think he had the mental strength to do it. But on day 5, none of that mattered anymore. This was no longer about comfort or safety or doing things the right way. This was about survival, pure, desperate survival. Aron prepared himself mentally, he thought, of his family. His mother, who had always supported his adventures. His father, who had taught him to love the outdoors. His sister, who understood him. He thought of the life he still wanted to live, the mountains he hadn't climbed, the places he hadn't seen, the people he hadn't met, and he made the decision. To survive, he would have to cut off his own arm, not with a saw, not with surgical tools, with a dull multi-tool blade, the kind you use to open packages, to tighten screws, to cut rope, and he would have to do it while trapped, dehydrated, exhausted, delirious, alone. This was not bravery, this was survival in its most raw, most primal form. First he had to break the bones in his forearm, the radius and ulna, 2 bones thick and strong. His dull blade couldn't cut through bone. He had tried. It was impossible. So he used the boulder itself. The thing that had trapped him would now be the tool of his escape. He positioned his arm, applied pressure, torque, leveraged his body weight, and twisted. He felt the bones flex, bend, and then, snap. The sound echoed in the canyon, sharp, final. The pain was indescribable, a white-hot explosion that shot through his entire body. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because stopping meant dying. Now that the bones were broken, he could begin cutting, through skin, through muscle, through tendon, through nerves. He started with the knife blade, sawing, cutting. The blade was so dull it was almost useless. He switched to the pliers on the multi-tool, using them to tear, to rip, to separate tissue. Blood flowed. Not as much as you might think. His body was so dehydrated there wasn't much blood left to lose. Every nerve he cut sent shockwaves of agony through his body. But he kept going. He worked methodically, focused. He couldn't afford to pass out, couldn't afford to fail. It took over an hour, 60 minutes of continuous, deliberate self-amputation. The pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced, beyond anything he had imagined possible. But Aron Ralston did not stop, because stopping meant dying, and he was not ready to die. Finally, mercifully, it was done. The last strand of tissue separated, his arm fell away, and Aron Ralston was free. When it was done, Aron looked at what remained of his arm, a bloody stump, wrapped quickly with the tube from his water bladder, secured with climbing rope as a tourniquet. He was free, but he was dying. He had lost blood. He was severely dehydrated. He was in shock. His body was failing, but he was free, and that meant he had a chance. Aron gathered what little remained of his supplies, his backpack, his water bottle, empty now, his video camera. He left his severed arm behind, trapped forever under the boulder that had held him for 5 days, and he began to move. First, he had to get out of the slot canyon. That meant rappelling down a 65-foot cliff face with one arm, exhausted, bleeding, delirious. He rigged his rope, used his teeth and his remaining hand to tie the knots, wrapped the rope around his body, and descended. Somehow, impossibly, he made it to the bottom. Then he walked through the desert, under the brutal sun, miles from anywhere. He had no water, no food, no energy left, but he walked, one step, then another, then another. His vision was tunneling, his hearing was fading, his body was shutting down, but he kept moving, because he had not come this far to die now. And then he saw them, two figures in the distance, hikers, a Dutch couple named Eric and Monique Meyer with their son Andy. They were miles from where Aron had been trapped, just hiking, just exploring. They saw him, a man covered in blood, missing an arm, stumbling toward them. Aron called out, his voice barely a whisper. "Help, I need help, I've been trapped. 5 days." They ran to him, gave him water, food. They radioed for help. Within minutes, a helicopter was dispatched. A search and rescue team was mobilized. The helicopter found them, landed in a clearing. Paramedics rushed to Aron, checked his vitals, started an IV, stabilized him. They airlifted him to a hospital in Moab, then transferred him to a trauma center in Grand Junction, Colorado. Aron Ralston had survived. Against all odds, against all probability, against every logical expectation, he survived. Aron Ralston lost his arm that day in Blue John Canyon. But in many ways he gained more than he lost. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. His body had been hours away from complete organ failure. His kidneys were on the verge of shutting down permanently. His heart was struggling. If he had waited even one more day, he would have died. The decision to amputate his own arm, as horrific as it was, had saved his life. Aron spent weeks recovering, learning to live with one arm, adjusting to a new reality. But he didn't become bitter. He didn't retreat from life. He didn't blame the wilderness or curse his fate. Instead, he returned to the mountains. 6 months after the accident, Aron was climbing again. He learned to use a prosthetic arm. He adapted his techniques. He continued pursuing the life he loved. He climbed all of Colorado's 14,000-foot peaks again, this time in winter, with one arm. He got married. He became a father. He held his son, the child he had seen in his hallucinations on day 4, with his remaining arm. He wrote a book about his experience, between a rock and a hard place. He shared his story not to glorify suffering, but to remind people of something simple and profound. Life is fragile, precious, temporary. Decisions matter. Connections matter. Telling people where you're going matters. Aron now never hikes alone without leaving detailed plans. He tells people exactly where he's going, when he'll be back, what route he's taking. Not out of fear, out of respect. Respect for the wilderness. Respect for those who love him. Respect for life itself. Because survival is not about strength. Survival is about choices. And sometimes the choice is between surrender and one more breath. This was the story of Aron Ralston. One man, one canyon, 5 days, one impossible decision, and the unbreakable will to live.